Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the wonderful people at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is an organisation that exists to support animal studies scholars in New Zealand, in Australia and around the world. But ASA relies on memberships to be able to do that work. So if you're not a member of ASA, please think about joining. Membership is just $50 Australian. I'm very proud to be a member of ASA, and I hope you think about becoming a member too. That's ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. Well, let's get down to business then. Once again, we're at the beautiful University of Kent, and it's just wonderful to be here because it is such a hotbed of animal studies work. And this week I'm joined by one of their preeminent animal studies scholars, Professor Donna Landry. Donna is from the School of English at the University of Kent, and today we're going to discuss her book chapter, Horses at Waterloo, 1815, which will appear in a forthcoming book, Equine Cultures, which will be published by University of Chicago Press. So welcome to the podcast, Donna.
Hello, Siobhan. Thank you. It's great to be here.
So, Donna, why this work? What inspired this chapter?
Well, I have done a lot of work on horses in history, and I've also done work on Anglo-Ottoman relations and comparative empire studies and how horses in particular figure in that. And I was asked to do a piece on Waterloo for 2015, since there was a lot of reenactment and a lot of enthusiasm, by colleagues at the University of Porto who had various seminars in relationality, and they wanted me to consider Waterloo from my sort of comparative perspective. And if animals came into it, that was very good as well. So looking at Waterloo riding for the first time, exploring it for the first time, I was amazed at how much we can learn about horse-human relations from the outpouring of soldiers' memoirs and other writing about Waterloo, including some quite famous literary texts such as Byron's Childe Harold, Thackeray's Vanity Fair. Once you start inquiring into this, it really opens things up. And I found, as you find in the piece, some intertextual relationships with Black Beauty, the piece of writing that is most people's introduction to horses as subjects, the question of animal autobiography, the equine slave narrative. So many rich things open up there, and it seems to me that it's very likely Anna Sewell was influenced by some of the memoirs of Waterloo in particular. He was a captain at Waterloo. He was then General Alexander Cavalier Mercer's account. He was a Royal Horse Artilleryman, and he wrote so tenderly and movingly about the suffering of horses as well as humans in the battle. And as you can imagine, as an artilleryman, he was directly responsible for much of that. So it really was an ethical and moral dilemma. And he doesn't, in any sense, spare himself. He's very self-critical as well as very sympathetic. So as someone who's always stayed as far away from war and military history as possible, I found myself really drawn in because of some of the ethical issues posed, the question of honor and honorable conduct in war, the question of residues of chivalry and what that might mean in terms of horse-human partnerships. So that's how I began.
Wonderful. So, Donna, we've got listeners all around the world, and some of them may not be familiar with Waterloo. Can you tell us a little bit about what occurred?
Well, it was the last battle in the Napoleonic Wars, which is to say, from the point of view of Britain and the Allies, particularly the Prussians, but also Dutch, Belgians, forces from Hanover, from Brandenburg, from elsewhere in Europe. This was a united Allied front that was going to be joined later on by Russians and Austro-Hungarians against Napoleon's imperialist ambitions, expanding France into a potential empire. And in a way, the campaigns were all triggered in 1798 when Napoleon invaded Egypt, and then Britain in particular was anxious about India and trade routes. And so we begin that rivalry, which readers around the world who are familiar with Edward Said's Orientalism will know very well, the battle between Britain and France for imperial dominance. The thing about Waterloo is that you have an allied entity. It wasn't just the Duke of Wellington and the Brits, it was allies all across Europe and beyond against France, which at that point, under Napoleon, had imperialist ambitions in the name of liberty, fraternity, and equality, however, still imperialist ambitions. So the self-determination of small nations comes into the picture, which is, I think, one reason why, given that the Allies won the victory, they felt so complacent and smug about it, which of course led to problems later on historically. Right. But it did bring a certain peace for a time to Europe.
Wonderful. So, Donna, can you tell us a little bit about the role or roles that horses would have played in war at this time?
Well, horses were the motor for everything, really, for economies generally. And as a result, they were instruments of war. They were the mounts of the cavalry. They were the mounts of all the officers, whether they were infantry, cavalry, or artillery. They drew the guns. They drew the wagons. And we mustn't forget that there were horses, yes, primarily in these battles, but also mules and sometimes donkeys. Really, equids are important here. And one of the things that comes out of the writing about Waterloo, where again, for the first time in a battle, there were lots of soldiers who were literate, right down to the privates, really right down to the lower ranks. And many of them felt that they were taking part in history. And so they penned letters, they penned diaries. And in those, we begin to see what kinds of affective relationships these guys had with horses, who were their partners, their companions. And they were, if you like, a sort of horse-human metonymy, really. On the one hand, a war machine, or part of a war machine, but on the other hand, a case of partnership or companionship or mutuality whose lives depend upon each other.
Well, I'm so glad that you reminded me that it wasn't just horses, it was also donkeys, and the poor old donkey is such a reliable and hardworking equine and has suffered greatly, I think, throughout history as a result. But you see a lot of hierarchical issues in your analysis. Can you tell us a little bit about the hierarchy or the class issues that come into play?
Well, the class issues are there amongst the humans, of course, as in any military hierarchy. And the thing is, this is also played out in terms of the horses themselves. And questions of breeding, which is always a problem, isn't it? Because breed is one of those constructs, just as race is, one of those ideological fictions that also has, unfortunately, real material effects. So we could see that in the case of Waterloo, and in particular the English accounts, very self-congratulatory since the Allies had won, that something emerges we could call code thoroughbred, in which it was decided that the fact that the Allies had won had to do, among other things, with the superiority of at least some of the, as they would put it, horse flesh that they had been able to bring to the battle. And in particular, the notion of the so-called English thoroughbred, which was really a mongrel creation based on native stock, native British stock, but also the infusion of Eastern blood. This is what my book Noble Brutes is about, how Eastern horses changed or transformed English culture. So in Code Thoroughbred, we find in various letters after the battle, the Waterloo letters edited by Siborne and other accounts, the notion that the horses who were best, as in best bred, as well as best conditioned, but with the most athletic potential, were the ones who carried the day. And that the English, of course, in particular, and that always means that they're not mentioning the Irish, although the English have always been entirely dependent upon Ireland as a horse breeding nation, have produced something in the name of the thoroughbred based upon these Eastern blood horses that is distinctive to them and that is the perfect companion for war and also, of course, for sport in peace, for racing, for hunting, for eventing, etc.
And then linked to that, there's also a story about modernity, and, you know, this is, I guess, the start of the move towards more modern forms of military engagement, and we're starting to head away from the horse and into the automobile and etc. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of that in your analysis?
Well, there is an argument, John Ellis in his Global History of Cavalry makes it, an argument that cavalry was already obsolete by the Napoleonic Wars because of improved firepower, increased firepower. However, the military establishment continues to think that military masculinity must be embodied on horseback. And I want to say these attachments to horses also continue to make military masculinity and horsemanship and equestrianism all one. So that we have how many poignant stories about later wars, about the Crimean War, about the First World War, even the Second World War, when there were still cavalry charges against guns, against tanks. Now, the mechanization begins to come into play in such a way that, for example, the early flyers, or early pilots were spoken, or the early Air Force was spoken of as the cavalry of the skies. And so the development of new forms of technology are often patterned upon previous ones. Someone's told me, I've never been able to find any actual evidence of this, that the very first seats in early aircraft that were being made, particularly in Britain, were based on the English hunting saddle. That if you could spend a long day out hunting in this seat, then that was ideal for flying, a long day's flying.
How wonderful. I was listening to a paper by a PhD candidate at the University of Sheffield recently about the emergence of automobiles, and there's so much discussion about them displacing horses. And one of the things he said was that one of the first words they were toying with for what we now call cars or automobiles was the horseless carriage or something like this. They were so wedded to this notion of, So
the horseless carriage, horsepower. It's still there in the language, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So, Donna, I'm just wondering, do you know much about what happened post-war? What happened with the horses after the battle's been won? Do you know much about that history?
Well, after Waterloo, a lot of horses were actually repatriated, and in particular, there were attempts to rehabilitate those that had been wounded. Fortunately, it was only across the Channel, so it was easier to bring horses home from this campaign than it had been from others. And there was a chap called Astley who got some of his his medical students to remove pieces of shrapnel and rehabilitate the horses. So my piece actually begins with an epigraph of him describing what it was like to see the horses, some of them that he had brought to his own place, galloping. And he said the funny thing was, in the morning they would form up and perform cavalry maneuvers, but then of course they would just gallop off in all directions. They're horses after all. And freedom is one of the things that the spirit of the horse, of course, is associated with good reason.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Donna, you end the chapter with what I think is a really beautiful sentence, and you start off by saying that war horses are a walking contradiction. And you go on to say that in some senses they're companion animals, in some senses, they're part of something else. What do you take from this piece in terms of making better sense of the human-non-human relationship?
Well, I think one of the reasons I wanted to write the piece in the way that I did was I was trying to answer Vincent Desprez' call that animal studies scholars consider that the questions they ask about a species should be questions of interest to that species. And so I was trying to think about Waterloo from the horse's point of view. Now, of course, that means one thinks about water and forage in the first instance. But beyond that, there is the question of horse-human partnerships, relationships, the deep sociality that develops. And that's what I wanted to enter into and see what pieces of evidence there were. Doing this kind of work in a way is parallel to subaltern studies, in which we try to see through the interstices of the archive traces of agency, or in some cases of expression, of those who haven't left their own written accounts. And as I say, I just found the Waterloo writing an amazingly rich source for this, especially when considering then, as I say, the literary record that also we get to take account of and look at in a new way by thinking about the horses as opposed to just assuming they're part of the furnishings of something like Byron's poem Childe Harold.
And are you prepared to hazard a guess as to what it might have meant for a horse to be there? Do you think they bond with the human that's riding them or controlling them, deeply, or would it just be a scary, overwhelming experience? Or
again, it would have varied enormously. This kind of operation would have been very heterogeneous, just as the humans themselves had very different relationships. An esprit de corps or lack of it. Some were very bonded, others were inexperienced. There's one account of a general who found himself without his charger at the critical moment, and he was riding his small bay hack who had never been to a battlefield before, and who is a civilian and completely terrified and overwhelmed by this. In fact, the two of them, meet their fate that day. Which is sad, but that also indicates how the other horses were quite accustomed to this. And there are even accounts in which, in the heat of battle, the horse would bite and lash out and kick at the enemy and try to defend the rider and indeed the rider's comrades. So, it's that question too. There's fight or flight with horses. Yeah. And the impetus to charge is about the flight mechanism, but there's also that fighting potential when there is some sense of an investment, again, in resisting an enemy.
And I think you're very right to point out to me that, these are also all individuals. So there, of course, was no one experience, was there? There were multitudes of experiences. Yeah, wonderful. Well, Donna, I ask everyone who comes on the podcast to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I hope so. They're good questions.
Oh, thank you. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Well, I'm so old that I do remember Peter Singer's Animal Liberation as the very first thing. But I would have to say that the most influential thing, and the thing that made me think that I could perhaps actually do some work in this field, was Donna Haraway's Primate Visions. So we've fast-forwarded to 1989. And that was such a rich and inspiring book that I began to think, how about ideology playing out in all these ways? How about the way animals are front and center? Another important piece was, in a different vein, Harriet Ritvo's essay from Representations on the Chillingham Cattle. And again, questions of nationalism and ideology and the way animal histories and animal pedigrees were completely bound up with these things. But she also always attends to the cattle in themselves. And I think her work, as again, a more conventional kind of history in a way, but a very rich kind of history, was also very inspiring in terms of wanting to do pro-animal work myself. She had also written The Animal State, which again is a wonderful book about the whole development of animal rights and animal welfare, its longer history.
Yes, I love Harriet Ritvo's work. It's wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, in collaboration with Gerald McLean in a book called Materialist Feminisms, and we were trying to work through the debates to do with socialist feminism, Marxist feminism, deconstruction, anti-racism, anti-imperialism. How do all of these things cohere into something we're calling materialist feminisms? We wanted to end with a green chapter, again, inspired by Haraway and others, because any kind of social movement would have to be an ecological one, an environmental one, and one in which animals and multi-species justice were part of the picture. That would be the only kind of anti-racist feminism that would really be answerable to what's needed. And that was in the early 90s. I think all these things are still true, perhaps even more true than they were then. Sad to say.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I suppose just down the years, if I had to pick one, and as I've already said, Harriet Ritvo is very important, but I guess I would say Donna Haraway, because she's been so globally influential to so many people. And I do also, I have got to know her personally, which has also been very rewarding. I want to say that there was a kind of strange concatenation of things, because in 2003 I was trying to finish transform a monograph in progress that was about the countryside, but also about animals in the countryside. And I began to think, well, actually, instead of this being a book about the making of the English hunting seat and the way English horsemanship was different from continental horsemanship, notions that had grown out of my book called The Invention of the Countryside, what I really wanted to do was a book about the horses. And I was particularly moved by a picture by John Wotton of the bloody-shouldered Arabian. And so in 2003, I wrote a piece about the bloody-shouldered Arabian, and that was the year that Donna Haraway's Companion Species Manifesto came out, in time for me to read it and be able to think that through and take that on board as well, and that was a wonderful moment. So keep on trucking, Donna, you're doing the right thing.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, we can keep drawing attention to them. We can keep trying to raise consciousness. We can keep trying to overcome human arrogance. We can keep trying to critique anthropocentrism, but critique has its limits. One of the things I think Donna Haraway is excellent at is being critical of puritanical critique and saying things are much more complicated, much messier than that. No one has clean hands. Life and death and killing and eating are inextricably bound up with being mortal, whether you're human or another animal.
Absolutely, yes. None of us have clean hands, that's for sure. If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I wish that we could listen better, attend more. I wish it were more possible to know whether animals are simply being polite and courteous and putting up with us, or whether we actually are exchanging with them in ways that are mutually gratifying. If only we could better judge reciprocity, because I think we're not here, I'm not only talking about relationships within domestication, although I do think, and here I'd just like to plug Jocelyn Porchet's book, An Ethics of Animal Labor, which is a wonderful book about animal husbandry. I recommend it to everyone. That if only we could be a little bit more certain, again, that our own arrogance was being countered. I do think animals very much participate in relationships with humans whenever there is an encounter, whenever there is an exchange. And what I simply wish that one could be a little bit more confident that one was doing the right thing and that we were better at listening and learning from, if we're going to become more cosmopolitical beings working towards multi-species justice, then we really need to move towards that horizon of being able to listen and learn and respond.
Yeah, fascinating. Wonderful. Well, what are you working on next?
Well, I hope I will be finishing my Waterloo book at some point. I'm also involved in some collaborations. I've given you there the program for an event that happened at the Wallace Collection last spring called Horses and Courts, The Reigns of Power.
Yes.
Finally, historians of courts seem to have got it at how important horses are.
Oh, yes.
So we were hoping to plan another event, probably in France, maybe at Versailles and Chantilly, and again, try to inquire into the longer history of horse-human partnerships, even in terms of strategies of governance as well as ceremonies and displays of power. We'd like it to be a more global event and attending to courts outside Europe as well. And I'm also involved in terms of my Anglo-Ottoman studies, another Evliya Çelebi project. If you look at my webpage at the University of Kent, you'll see the Evliya Çelebi project. We're going to be doing another ride in 2019, sort of 10 years on from the previous one, in which we followed an Ottoman traveler on horseback. He called himself a world traveler, and he rode horses wherever he possibly could, and he speaks openly of his love for them, which for a 17th century Ottoman gentleman, who they're not usually given to being very autobiographical, but it's really quite revealing of, again, a different kind of relationship to horses. They are his companions, his more than brothers, his soul brothers. he tends to ride stallions and geldings. He rides some mares on his way to Mecca and is amazed at how wonderful and how fit and hardy they are. But nevertheless, there's always that masculinity question when you're dealing with early modern masculinity in particular. So this will be making an expedition on horseback. So once again, one will learn from the horses, who know so much more about being on the road and taking to the road and the pleasure, the lure of the horizon than we do, and who can read topography better than we can.
Wow, goodness. So how can people find out more about your work?
Well, you can look at the web page, as I say, at the
Yes.
University of Kent. If you just Google Donna Landry
Yes.
Kent, you'll get it.
Wonderful.
And there will be various links to projects and publications.
Yes, and I should also add that there's a very vibrant animal studies community here. Yeah.
Yes, we have the Kent Animal Humanities Network, CON. So again, if you Google that, you'll find various projects. There's, for example, a conference coming up at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich in April called Maritime Animals, which will be taking up the project of cosmopolitan animals, a conference we had several years ago. There's now a book of that. And that involves collaborations from Charlotte Slay, Professor of History, whom you'll be meeting a bit later, and Karen Jones, as well as Caroline Rooney and other colleagues from the School of English.
How fabulous. Well, Donna, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can like us on Facebook at Knowing Animals. And don't forget to leave a review on iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.